we'll move on to your presentation. Ready to go.
Okay, thanks a lot for the opportunity to present. I'm going to take a little bit of a more focused approach and look specifically at the PC MACT in terms of the monitoring requirements, and more specifically, what are some of the requirements, get into some details on some of them, and focus a little bit on solutions. So if you can move to the next slide. So what we're going to cover today, go over some basics. Carl did a good job of getting a real good overview of the MACT rule, what the limits were, what the monitoring requirements were, and we'll cover some of that. Specifically, maybe talk a little bit more about the requirements of PS11, because through our discussion with a lot of the cement plants, of course, the PS11 rule in particular is something they haven't had to deal with yet, and there's some unique challenges in PS11 that were alluded to earlier in regards to the calibration and that kind of stuff. That then we'll just jump into various solutions for SEMS. SICK as a company has a quite large portfolio of CEM equipment, and so from our standpoint, wanted to give you an idea of what we would consider best solutions as a company that can supply monitors for all these different monitoring requirements. And then at the end, we'll summarize and do some questions. So if we can advance forward a couple slides. We saw this already. Carl put this up. This is the emission limits for new and existing kilns for mercury, total hydrocarbon, particulate matter, and HCl. Let's move ahead. PM-SEMS in particular applies to the kiln and the clinker coolers as defined by the PC MACT rule. So the PM-SEMS would be on the kiln and clinker cooler stacks and must comply with PS11. PS11 is a performance spec that was promulgated, I would say, probably about 6 years ago or so, and has been getting a lot of traction in the utility market, specifically through consent decrees, but I think everyone who's been following utility MAC expects PM-SEMS to come more formally there. PS11 requires some initial correlations and some follow-up response audits that are a little bit unique. Of course, it requires what would be analogous to an annual RADA, but also requires a more detailed response correlation over every 3 years, which is a little bit unique to the MACT rule. As part of the PM-SEMS limit, you must also install and operate flow monitors, and you must measure the clinker production because the rule lists the original limits as pounds per ton of clinker. So move on to the next slide, please. PS11 in particular has some specific requirements in terms of correlation and ongoing checks of the device itself. And we start with the initial correlation on it, or what's widely known as ICA. And there's two main requirements. First, the unit must pass a 7-day drift, which means it must pass 0 and span checks over a 7 or 8 day period without interference or maintenance. And then, and more problematic for people that have been saddled with PS11 requirements in the past, is that you must do a correlation against a known reference method, usually a method 5 or 5B. And the requirement says you have to conduct at least 15 different reference method tests at, and here's usually the rub, 3 different particulate mass concentrations that represent the range of unit operation. Normally, the plant is forced to then detune the process in some way to achieve these higher mass loading concentrations. And when a utility plant has an ESP, that can sometimes be not as hard as other applications. Bag houses become very problematic, and how do you create these upper level dust concentrations to do your curve fit against the PM-SEMS and the reference method? Carl alluded to the test that's going on up at DT&E, where they're testing a number of PM-SEMS and also testing this QAQC device that generates aerosol of particular concentrations as a surrogate to test. There's also tests going on where people are collecting fly ash from the bag house or the ESP and actually re-injecting plant fly ash into the process using mass balance and things like that to generate these. But the ICAC, or the ICA, is really the crux of the whole PM-SEMS discussion, and this is where most of the heartache occurs for the user, because after the unit's correlated and you have a good correlation, the unit operates for the most part like an opacity analyzer. There's some more QAQC requirements, but maintenance-wise, they're not difficult to handle. But being sure that you have a good understanding of how the process changes affect the PM concentration and how you can modify the process or manipulate the process to create these is something that takes some time up front. And so I would encourage people to get the units in and not rush into the ICA and take some time with that part of it. We've got, I would say, probably 60 to 70 of these units installed in the U.S., and we've got a lot of experience with this, and I think when you take your time up front with the planning, that's where you have success on the ICAs. So we can move to the next slide. Ongoing QAQC, they require quarterly audits, just like you would see with an opacity analyzer. The only real difference between PS11 and the PS1 opacity rule is that the filters aren't required to be NIST traceable, so you can simply send the filters back to the manufacturer for testing. And then on a yearly basis, you have to do what they call a relative response audit, RRA, which is similar to a RADA, and you do, instead of a 15 test run like you did with the correlation audit, a more pared down 3 reference method test comparison to the PM-SEMS as found status. Next slide. This is just a table that shows some results of a typical filter audit. You can see the absolute differences on the side. In general, the ACA requirements are plus or minus absolute difference of about 10%. So you can see in general the PM-SEMS perform quite well in those regards. Next slide. Then outside of the quarterly and yearly test, over on a 3-year basis, you have to do what's called the response correlation audit. And this is a much more detailed test to verify the initial correlation curve over long periods of time. And in this case, you again have to do a multiple number of tests, in this case 12. And again, you have to do them at 3 different mass particulate concentrations. And just like a typical RADA, 9 out of the 12 you can use, and they have to fall into a curve created by the initial correlation to pass. Next slide. Here's some data from an initial correlation audit and an RCA test that was done. This was in a coal-fired utility. These were done about a year apart. So the light blue is the data that was generated during the initial correlation audit. You'll notice the 3 nice clusters at the 3 different particulate concentrations, and then the red indicates the response correlation audit that was done about a year later. And what you'll notice too, PS11 can be problematic, but the EPA also gives us quite liberal limits to meet. So basically, you'll see that dark blue line and red blue line; those represent the upper and lower limit you have to pass the RCA, and those lines represent 25% of your emission limit. Next slide. Total hydrocarbon simply must install and operate a CEM in accordance with Performance Spec 8, which is the performance spec for THC analyzers. But there were some caveats. For sources equipped with alkali bypass stack, you can use performance tests on a regular basis in lieu of a CEM. And they also gave an additional or an optional total organic HAP limit. But that limit just gives you a different limit to meet. It doesn't necessitate getting away from the CEM. And then, of course, this emission limit is corrected to 7% O2, except during startup and shutdown. Next slide. HCl, if the facility is equipped with a wet scrubber, then you can show compliance to the HCl limit through parameter monitoring of the scrubber, and otherwise you must install and operate a CEM with accordance to PS15, which specifically PS15 is a performance specification for FTIR analyzers. Because the EPA did not have a particular performance spec for HCl, they've said they will allow the use of alternative measurement techniques, and we'll discuss some of those techniques and what is able to be used, and infrared using gas filter correlation and TDL are 2 examples of that. but the EPA is currently in the process of developing a performance spec specific to HCl, and I would guess that at or near the end of the compliance period for MACT, that performance spec will be coming out, and it will be not technology specific. Next slide. Mercury, of course, we talked a lot about Mercury when Carl did, and the requirements there, of course, to install and maintain the Mercury SEMS in accordance with PS12A, and optionally you may use the sorbent trap according to PS12B, and of course then must install and operate a flow monitor for the mass calculations as part of the requirement. So jumping into the solutions, we'll kind of walk through these one at a time. I'm going to focus a lot on PM SEMS HCl in particular, just because they're somewhat unique and have some operational challenges, specifically PM SEMS, which we discussed earlier. So these are an example of what SIC would consider our best solution based on looking at our broad product portfolio, different measuring and monitoring techniques, what we would offer as a best solution for meeting all these monitoring requirements. Next slide. Next one. For the scattered light technique that we promote as best solution is the scattered light technique. Scattered light's an optical principle, and it's based on the fact that when light hits a particle, it's scattered in some way, diffracted or refracted or reflected. And if you can quantify the amount of light that's scattered off the particles, there becomes a relationship between that scattered light intensity and the dust concentration. The advantage to using scattered light over a more traditional technique like transmission or opacity is that it's much more sensitive to low concentrations. We're basically automating the process of sitting in a movie theater and seeing dust particles floating in front of the projector. If you can quantify the amount of light off those individual particles, you can correlate that to a dust concentration. Next slide. But of course, the light scattered and the light attenuation depends on different parameters like size and density and things like that. And so the regression curve that we talked about, we have to develop as part of the initial correlation audit, becomes a key component to PM SEMS accuracy and long-term stability. Next slide. So for dry gases, we use what we call our SP100, which is a scattered light device. It's a probe version, mounts from one side, and allows the user to get accurate PM SEMS data off of existing flanges. For wet gas, we use what we call our FWE200. It's a bypass system. We'll get into details on both of these in the next couple slides. The SP100 is a quite simple device. We use a laser light. We shine it through to the end of a probe where we've got a small slot. This is the standard way it's done. There's a number of manufacturers that sell and make these scattered light devices, and the probe versions are all very similar in form and function. Obviously, different probe lengths available based on process conditions, mounting conditions, whether you have a double-walled stack, single-walled stack. All the units are PES 11 compliant, and more importantly, and the reason one of our main criteria for choosing the solutions we do for this particular application is reliability and maintenance, because accuracy is very important, but also the ability to maintain it using reasonable resources is also important. So these devices, in particular this one you'll see is a maintenance interval, third-party tested of 3 months. And so when typically these are all tested to TUV standards, and what that means in short explanation is that you test it for a certain period of time, and then the published maintenance interval becomes half of that time. So the tested interval was 6 months, but the maintenance interval we can publish then becomes 3. And you'll see that in some of the other devices I show you too.